Bio. This is Mr. B. We're continuing on with Chapter 3 about ecology, and the second section of this chapter is going to be energy flow, and this is going to be important because in order to study how all living things interact with each other, we need to know where in fact all living things get their energy from, and because that's going to be the basis for most interactions is for energy, because that's going to be a big key here. So our first question that we need to ask is, where does the energy for life processes come from? So we're going to need to know where in the heck all of this energy comes from that makes all these processes go. So to start, we have something that are known as producers, and these include plants. So only plants and some algae and certain bacteria can capture energy from sunlight or chemicals and use that energy to produce food. And these organisms are called autotrophs. So we've mentioned this before. Organisms that can make their own food are called autotrophs. And again, going with the theme of producers, and without a constant input of energy, living systems cannot function, and sunlight is the main energy source for life on Earth. So this is just again going along with the same fact that we need energy in order to be able to study all of those processes that we talked about yesterday, all the different populations, all of the different ecosystems, all of those things. They would not exist if sunlight was not around. And in a few ecosystems, some organisms obtain energy from a source other than sunlight, so there are some organisms that are able to create their energy and absorb energy from areas outside of the sun. And some types of organisms rely on energy stored in these chemical compounds. So autotrophs use energy from the environment to fuel the assembly of simple inorganic compounds into complex organic molecules. So that's just taking, again, making things that really aren't into food, that making things that really cannot be absorbed as food, like sunlight, which we can't just eat sunlight, and they turn that into an organic molecule, which is just food. And these organic molecules combine and recombine to produce living tissue. So again, it's basically the food helping build us up, or again, maybe even build the plants up. Then we eat the plants and that helps build us up. And because they make their own food, autotrophs are called producers. So producers is another word for autotrophs because they produce their own food. And energy from the sun. So the best autotrophs harness solar energy through a process known as photosynthesis. We've talked about this before already. So during photosynthesis, these autotrophs will use light energy to convert carbon dioxide or CO2 in water into oxygen and energy-rich carbohydrates or sugars, is what we said, which is again where we get our food from, is when we eat their plants, we take in their sugars. And photosynthesis is responsible for adding oxygen to and removing carbon dioxide from Earth's atmosphere, which we mentioned this before. So plants will breathe in the CO2, take it out, and then they release oxygen for us to breathe in. And plants are the main autotrophs that we have on land. Algae are the main autotrophs in freshwater ecosystems in the upper layers of the ocean. So algae, I'm sure you guys have seen like the little pond scum floating around in here in areas on the summertime. That's just algae. And there are photosynthetic bacteria that are important in certain wet ecosystems such as tidal flats and salt marshes. So the main one, again, being plants. However, there are algae that will photosynthesize as well, alongside bacteria as well, which will carry out photosynthesis. However, there are some producers that can produce food in the absence of light, and this is when they use chemical energy to produce carbohydrates. The process is called chemosynthesis. So photosynthesis is using energy with the light, so whenever we see photo, we know that means light, and chemo is when we use chemicals or something else besides sunlight, so chemosynthesis. And here's an example of a bacterial cell that lives down in the deep sea vents of the ocean where there's no sunlight, so they can use things like hydrogen and oxygen combine, and that's what they use to make their energy. They don't actually use the sunlight, they take in whatever they have available to them at the time. And then chemosynthesis, again, is performed by several types of bacteria, and these bacteria represent a large proportion of living autotrophs. So when we just talked about bacteria and viruses in our last chapter about how they're everywhere, so this makes sense because there's a large portion of bacteria. There's more bacteria than any other living thing on the earth, so that's why they're going to be a big proportion of our living autotrophs, just because there's so many more of them. And some chemosynthetic bacteria will live in very remote places on Earth, such as volcanic vents or on the deep ocean floor and hot springs. We've mentioned this all before, or archaea bacteria. And others will live in common places such as tidal marshes along the coast. So that would be more of our eubacteria living in a normal area. So that's it for producers, things that can make their own energy. So now we have opposite of producer, we have a consumer. So there are many organisms that cannot harness energy directly from the physical environment. So that means they can't make their own food from the sun, can't make their own food from just different chemicals that are around. So these organisms that rely on other organisms for their energy and food supply are called heterotrophs, and another word for heterotrophs are consumers. So these are going to be things that have to eat food or eat something else to obtain their energy. They can't go out and make their own food. And again, us cooking breakfast for ourselves is not making our own food. So there are many different types of heterotrophs. So the first one are herbivores, and they eat plants. Carnivores will eat animals. Omnivores will eat both plants and animals. So hopefully you've heard of maybe those first three. So herbivores, plants, carnivores, animals. Omnivores would be both plants and animals. That's what humans would be. And then a new one would be detrivores, and these feed on plant and animal remains and other dead matter. So this would be like a vulture or something like that that feeds on roadkill. And then the last one are decomposers, and these break down organic matter. So these would be things like bacteria and fungi that will break down things so we can use them. So that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions.